Welcome back, Connecting Point. I was very happy to hear Doug's introduction to our study in Micah last week, where he gave us so much of the historical context about his life and his times and the way that he ended up doing his ministry in the southern portion of the kingdom, of the divided kingdom of Israel in the north and Judah in the south. So we'll be making some reference to the events of the foiled Assyrian invasion of Judah that we talked about last week in our discussion today. But I actually want to start our discussion of Micah chapter 1 by trying to zoom out a little bit and asking a more general question about what a prophet is and what are they supposed to do. So take a couple moments to think about that. As someone living in 21st century North America, I'm not entirely clear on what kind of the popular or mainstream Iron Age Hebrew culture was like. And we'll end up making some educated guesses as we go through Micah's prophecies. But I can tell you that today we have a bit of a weird relationship with the idea of prophecy in our culture. Our mainstream secular world doesn't really have prophets per se. You might find like fortune tellers or other people who are dabbling in occult and pagan practices, and some of them might even demonstrate something like ability in their given field, though I would argue that the vast majority of what you're seeing is charlatanism. We also have a large culture of pundits and forecasters, chattering class as it were, whose job is to try to explain whatever aspect of the world that they're focused on, be it politics or sports or pop culture or whatever. And then they probably are also supposed to make predictions about their areas of expertise, but you see all kinds of silliness and in all of this, and many of these people are kind of hacks. In the Christian context, you see more acceptance of prophecy because we do have these examples from the scriptures of prophetic work being done by people in both Old and New Testament. However, some church cultures have quite an abusive use of prophetic culture and how they operate. You probably have heard, if you've been around the church for a while, people lead off a discussion with something like, well, God told me, and then they go on to tell you what they want you to do. Sometimes this is a sincerely held belief, but I don't know, I think it's also often a spiritualizing kind of a disguise for someone just trying to push their own agenda forward. So really what I'm interested in, more than all the different ways that this kind of thing can get abused, is to think about what the Bible actually wants to tell us about prophecy. So the Bible gives us a story about how to measure a prophet. In Jeremiah you get a couple of stories from Jeremiah 18 and 28, but we're going to focus on 28 right now. In Jeremiah chapter 28, Judah has started to be taken into exile in Babylon. And this fellow named Hananiah, who is in tight with the temple hierarchy, is predicting, prophesying. He even says, the word of the Lord has come to me, saying that. So he's making this word of the Lord type of prediction. And what Hananiah predicts is that the exiles will be returning within 2 years. Jeremiah is an outsider to the temple hierarchy. He's actually quite unpopular with them. And he ends up in jail and in a pit and all kinds of other places because of his not being tight with the temple hierarchy. But Jeremiah basically says, amen, like that's so be it. Yeah, please, God, let it be. But also, I don't think you're right. Many of the prophets who've come before you, Hananiah, have prophesied war and disaster and plague. And if you're prophesying peace and prosperity when all these other guys are prophesying war and plague, we only know that if what you say comes from the Lord, if it actually becomes true. Hananiah ends up being wrong, and that's why we don't have a book of Hananiah. The exile ends up taking 70 years, in line with what the other prophets had said, and Hananiah himself ends up dying shortly in accordance with the prophecy of Jeremiah's that comes further down in chapter 28. So this story shows us a couple of things about prophecy that I want you to kind of hold on to as we get into our story today and into the text today, because we're not really reading much of the story. But as you also think about the role of prophetic speech in the church at large and in your life in particular. So the first principle is that prophecy is about telling the truth. We read in the last book study that we did through the book of Hebrews that God spoke at many times and in diverse ways in Hebrew 1 verse 1. So you can think about this being like through creation, Genesis 1, in the beginning God speaks heaven and earth into existence. In dreams and visions, like what Abraham and the other patriarchs experienced, or David or Solomon or these kings, they experience these dreams and visions of God. Or maybe to Moses, where Moses has this series of face-to-face encounters with God, starting with the burning bush, but then these other hard to describe face-to-face experiences like you see related in Exodus 33 or Deuteronomy 34, where God is giving Moses the law and he is meeting with him in this more personal, intimate way. And then, of course, through prophets as well, and God speaks to many different people through the prophets. Both through their writings, but then also like through specific stories, like you can think of David receiving the prophet Nathan into his court and then listening to Nathan, who has a word from the Lord for David. These kind of prophetic instances are not as clear as something like God speaking to Moses face to face and giving him the laws, but the way that prophecy is to work is it's a message that's given to trigger kind of a new way of thinking for people who are in covenant with God. So what you end up seeing in the New Testament is that Jesus and the other the New Testament writers refer to words from the Old Testament with things like God says, not God said. And this shows like the accordion nature of prophecy, that prophecy is true to a time and place, but it's actually got this stretchy kind of characteristic about it where it will stretch and expand, and the principles of the true words will remain true across time and space. So when we read through some of these old prophecies, like we'll be reading in Micah, you're sometimes going to be startled by just how clearly they speak into problems that are faced in our context today. But sometimes we're just going to be confused by the strange idioms or word plays that would have been really powerful or pointy or relevant to the initial hearer or another intended audience. What you see throughout the Bible is this through line of God's eternal truth and purposes. And Old Testament and New Testament prophecy is always consistent with what the rest of God's word says. For this reason, when we hear or read other more modern people who are getting at the same thing, God's eternal truths and purposes, we sometimes have this experience of feeling like we're being prophesied to. So I'm thinking about, like, I've read books by C.S. Lewis or G.K. Chesterton or other people who have this kind of like deep insight into culture. And they've both been dead for many decades at this point, but some of the ideas that they were working on and getting at have had this like prophetic ripple throughout the decades of people reading their works, because they were getting at the eternal truths and purposes of God in their writing about their times, their culture. I think that's an interesting thing to think about. So with all this in mind, prophecy isn't just about foretelling things that are going to happen. It's also about identifying the real, situation in the world, the real things that are happening, and especially understanding and pointing out the spiritual conditions that are undergirding the rest of reality. Prophets are people who see how heaven and earth are overlapping, and that's what the prophetic function is within kind of the people of God. Now, the other thing to remember, so that's the first one, prophecy is about telling the truth. And the second thing is that prophecy isn't magic. It's not magic words, right? As Jeremiah suggested, the words aren't prophecy unless they come true. The human words, the prophet's words, don't speak reality into existence. Only God's words have done that or can do that. And the power isn't even from the words themselves. The power is from God, right? And that's you can read Isaiah 55:11 to kind of see Isaiah break down that notion of that it's not the words, it's actually the speaker who has the power. When you think about God speaking truth into existence, we don't do that. We're observing the real reality, right? God is in prophecy. God is demonstrating His sovereignty over creation through through prophetic truth. And one phrase that I came across as I was researching this section is this idea that prophecy is a way for the invisible God, the invisible creator and sustainer, to make himself audible. So we also see that a prophecy isn't a doom or destiny. It's often kind of conditional. So one example is that story from Jeremiah 18, and that's the one where Jeremiah is exploring the imagery of the potter and the clay, which shows us this. The whole story of Jonah shows us the conditional nature of prophecy. In that story, of course, Jonah goes to Nineveh and he declares to the Ninevites, you're all going to die, basically. And they repent, and then God withholds his judgment from them. And then Jonah's mad about the whole thing. But we see that as well in the story that we heard last week about King Hezekiah, who had listened to Isaiah and who had listened to Micah, our prophet that we're studying right now. And he ends up repenting and having this time of religious reformation within Judah and Jerusalem particularly. And what happens is God withholds his judgment for a time because of the faithfulness and the faithful response to his true warnings, right? Okay, so hopefully, keeping those things in mind, we're going to break our study into two sections today. The first section, verses 1 to 7, has this introductory note about Micah's receiving the word of the Lord, and then verses 2 to 7 lay out the accusations that Micah is making, and actually it's God, who is making these accusations against Samaria, which is the capital city, and it's the stand-in name for the northern kingdom, the northern 10 tribes, Israel, who are taken into captivity by the Assyrians in the 720s before Christ. So let's begin by reading through these first 7 verses. The word of the Lord that came to Micah of Moresheth during the reigns of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, the vision he saw concerning Samaria and Jerusalem. Hear, you peoples, all of you, listen, earth and all who live in it, that the sovereign Lord may bear witness against you, the Lord from his holy temple. Look, the Lord is coming down from his dwelling place. He comes down, and he treads on the heights of the earth. The mountains melt beneath him, and the valleys split apart like wax before the fire, like water rushing down a slope. All this is because of Jacob's transgression, because of the sins of the people of Israel. What is Jacob's transgression? Is it not Samaria? What is Judah's high place? Is it not Jerusalem? Therefore, I will make Samaria a heap of rubble, a place for planting vineyards. I will pour her stones into the valley and lay bare her foundations. All her idols will be broken to pieces. All her temple gifts will be burned with fire. I will destroy all her images, since she gathered her gifts from the wages of prostitutes. As the wages of prostitutes, they will again be used. Just very casual, light accusation of prostitution. So I want you to notice a few elements from these verses here. The first is that in verse 2, we have this courtroom formula that is being established. God is going to be acting as both prosecution and as judge. The subject is not just the north, Israel, or the south, Judah, or even the whole Hebrew people. It's actually, the Hebrew people are standing for the whole earth. He's saying, look out the whole earth. I want you all to hear about what's going on. And that's referring to this covenant relationship that God makes with Abraham and then with Moses, where the Hebrew people are going to be kind of a stand-in for problems that are going on with the rest of humanity. So the next verses, 3 through 4, use this very poetical, metaphorical kind of framing to describe God's presence and judgment coming down. And this would have been language that would have been familiar to an ancient Near Eastern audience. Lots of cultures had language like this to describe their gods coming down. But really what you want to be thinking of is the way that this language in this sequence is evoking what is going on up on top of Mount Sinai when Moses leads the Israelites to Sinai. In that story, God's holiness makes Moses holy, right? Like it's this transference. Moses becomes unbearably radiant, and the people have to put a veil over him because they can't look at him. This edifying effect happens as Moses brings them the law, and they are able to enter into covenant with God. But in this context, the people have broken their faith with the law, and so now we're going to be on the receiving end of wrath, which you read about in verse 5. When we read the stories of the exile of the northern tribes, we're going to be seeing that the Assyrian armies are destroying cities, killing people, taking captives away. But the prophet identifies the real user of the Assyrians is God. God is using the Assyrians as a tool, as a means of justice. And why is that? Well, verses 5, 6, and 7 tell us. There is deep moral rot in both the north in Israel and in the south in Judah. And it's infected even the capitals, especially Samaria, as we learn in verses 6 and 7. Verse 6 describes the devastation, and verse 7 provides the accusation. So the crime in verse 7 is this mixture of idol worshiping and prostitution. So this is metaphorical on one hand, because you can think of it as Israel is cheating on God kind of with false gods. But it's also not just metaphorical. It's descriptive of exactly what they were doing. In the ancient Near Eastern context, and actually throughout most of the universal human history, the natural religions, if you want to call them that, the sinful natural religions that are that emerge, these polytheistic religions, pagan religions, if you want to call them that, kind of devolve into two things. One of them is human sacrifice, and the other one is ritual prostitution, so death and generating new life, right? So you get these hints throughout the narrative of the Old Testament that the Canaanites, who had been displaced by Israel in Joshua's conquest, had been judged by God for this evil, human sacrifice and ritual prostitution, and Israel had been told to eradicate these evil religious practices as not befitting behavior for the people of God. But they didn't do this thoroughly, and throughout the history of the judges and the kings that you can read about in earlier books in the Old Testament, you see these practices kind of bleeding back into Hebrew culture and corrupting them. Most pervasively, you see cult prostitution being kind of rampant and widely practiced. Though as you get further into the story of the kings of Judah, you'll actually find Hezekiah's heir, Manasseh, ends up engaging in child sacrifice as well. So Micah is pointing to these abominable practices, both the normalization of cult prostitution in the service of the false gods of the Canaanites, but also of this like further ritualized thing that would happen in these cultic practices where the false god would be embodied by a priest or a priestess, and then would have sexual relations with someone to create the bloodlines of the gods, the demigods, right? And this was a common practice actually throughout the ancient world, and it's kind of disturbing. It's extremely disturbing. Behavior like this destroys the morality of the people, and the invisible creator and sustainer God cannot abide this kind of behavior. As such, these false gods, which ultimately are nothing more than things made of metal and wood by human hands, are destroyed and turned back into the raw materials from which they came. Now, all of that might sound a little exotic. We don't really have like that widely seen in our culture today. I mean, we can talk about ways that we do human sacrifice and cult prostitution, but I want you to begin to consider how these same kinds of things do end up being practiced. We don't really have ritualized or religious things that we do where you acknowledge spirits before you participate in some sort of sinful behavior. Maybe some people do. But I kind of want to point out, like, how is someone using pornography and bringing themselves sexual gratification through that, doing something other than worshiping Aphrodite or Isis or some other fertility god or goddess? How is someone who lies and cheats to make more money than they might otherwise be doing something other than worshiping money or mammon or whatever other greedy money god you want to talk about? What about putting your trust into the power of a social network to bring humankind together and solve all of our problems, the way you might have heard Mark Zuckerberg talk about his goals for Facebook back in the early days of the social network? Is that not worshiping Hephaestus or Thoth or some other technology god, falling prey to the spirit of the Tower of Babel? I kind of want to submit to you that all of our new problems are old problems. We've just given them new names and a veneer of rationality. Science tells us that we can do this, but the spiritual holes that are inside of humankind are the same as they've ever been, and we still turn to the same stupid things: money, sex, physical prowess, youth, power, technology, food, popularity, whatever else. You can name all kinds of other things. We turn these things into our gods. And though some of these things, maybe even most of them, are goods in some sense, they are not the good. The creator and sustainer God, the one who actually can speak truth and speak things into existence. And so they become destructive of us who bear our Creator's image. Our lives, all aspects of them, are suffused with spiritual meaning because we're not merely meat bag bodies with some sort of electrochemical freakout accident happening that's causing this illusion of soul and spirit. We are dust that has been breathed in with the breath of life from the Lord, from the Creator. And we've been imprinted with God's image. And when we cheapen that by honoring some other God with a lesser image than that of our Creator, we participate in cheapening ourselves. We participate in decay into the same evil patterns that humans have always been involved in. And we've been struggling with this since the fall. Okay, so I probably need to give you some time and a table talk to think about these things for a moment. So here's kind of the table talk question that I want to throw to you. Do you see personal sin or social evil as having a spiritual aspect or element to it? And where do you notice this? All right, so we've framed that previous text, verses 6 and 7 especially, as being the word of the Lord. And so what we're going to see in verses 8 to 16 are Micah's response to this word and also a prophetic declaration over some of the cities in and around Jerusalem. So let's read through his response. Verse 8. Because of this, I will weep and wail. I will go about barefoot and naked. I will howl like a jackal and moan like an owl. For Samaria's plague is incurable. It has spread to Judah. It has reached the very gate of my people, even to Jerusalem itself. Tell it not in Gath, weep not at all. In Beth Ophrah, roll in the dust. Pass by naked and in shame, you who live in Shaphir. Those who live in Zaanan will not come out. Beth Azel is in mourning. It no longer protects you. Those who live in Maroth writhe in pain, waiting for relief, because disaster has come from the Lord, even to the gate of Jerusalem. You who live in Lachish, harness fast horses to the chariot. You are where the sin of daughter Zion began, for the transgressions of Israel were found in you. Therefore you will give parting gifts to Moresheth-Gath. The town of Akzib will prove deceptive to the kings of Israel. I will bring a conqueror against you who live in Mareshah. The nobles of Israel will flee to Adullam. Shave your head in mourning for the children in whom you delight. Make yourself as bald as the vulture, for they will go from you into exile. All right, I hope you're as confused as I was, and still kind of am as you're reading that. Now, I want you to start by noticing that there's something of that chiastic shape to the prophecy given by Micah here. The bookend verses, verse 8 and 16, describe this first, how Micah is going to grieve over the state of Judah and Jerusalem and Israel, and then also how then the people at large should grieve over the state, the moral decay of their home. So, and then the middle point, so remember the chiasm is kind of, it builds towards a middle point, and the middle point's the main point. And that middle point is what you find in verse 12b, you could call it, where it's this idea of the disaster has come from the Lord even to the gate of Jerusalem. So Micah is proclaiming this prophetic disaster over Jerusalem. Because the real issue is that Samaria's idolatrous sin is being replicated in Judah and has even infected the Judahite capital, Jerusalem. And this is cause for mourning and repentance. So then you have this main body of the prophecy, which is with all these little word plays that are very much lost in translation to us who are reading it in English. Now, these cities that are named are all found in the plain kind of around Jerusalem. Many of them were fortified during Solomon's reign as king to provide defenses against opposing armies who were approaching Jerusalem, which was the big fortified city on top of Mount Zion, which kind of commanded the plain around it. So this was like the approaches, the cities that were the approaches to Jerusalem. So the Assyrians end up devastating all of these different towns following the exile of Israel. But then before their army was decimated by the Lord, and the angel of the Lord, as we read about in 2 Kings 19 last week, where the Assyrian army end up encamped outside the gates of Jerusalem, but then 185,000 of their men are just killed in a very quick fashion. It's unclear exactly what happens. God takes credit for it. And it's a deliverance, right? Hezekiah has prayed, he's repented, and Judah is spared from further Assyrian devastation. So Micah himself would have been quite familiar with all of these cities, as this was the part of Judah that he's from. His hometown is one of the towns named Moresheth Gath. And in verse 14, we see this play on its name. Moresheth Gath is something like Bride Town, and he makes a joke about losing a dowry there. So most of the rest of the cities have kind of a similar wordplay done with their name, either emphasizing the truth of their name. For example, up in verse 10, we have Beth Ophrah, which is Dust Town, where they're going to roll in the dust. Or you might get some sort of ironic barb that's directed at a town like in verse 13, we have Lachish named, which was well known as a chariot town. Solomon had outfitted a bunch of chariots and horses and riders, and he kept them stationed in Lachish as this place on the plain outside of Jerusalem where they could quickly kind of gear up and then ride out to wherever they needed to go. But what we see kind of done, so it's a place of military technology, right? The most important military technology of the day, where chariots are being used and people are trusting in chariots instead of in the name of the Lord. And what you see here is that the people of Lachish are supposed to harness up their chariots, and then they're going to run away instead of going and running out to victory in their chariots. So none of these word plays are kind of like as ham-fisted. I was trying to think of like what would be like a similar one from today. So the one I came up with was, because I'm not very creative, someone calling Winnipeg like lose-a-pig or something like that. But none of them are as ham-fisted as that. They're more pointed and directed, right? But this is kind of the idea of what's going on here. These place names are symbolic in the Hebrew mindset, and then they're now being symbolically used and manipulated by Micah to make kind of true statements about what's going to happen to these towns. The one further symbol that I thought I wanted to unpack a little bit more was the one from Shaphir, Beauty Town, which Micah says that the inhabitants will be naked and shamed. So you can kind of put that together with the dust town, Beth Ophrah, that is spoken of right before that, and it makes you think about the sequence in Genesis 3 where God covers the shame and the nakedness of Adam and Eve after they've sinned, and then curses the serpent to live in and crawl through and then eat the dust of the ground. And it's like he's putting these ideas together. The imagery that Micah is giving you is appealing to all these like hyperlinked ideas around the Old Testament. And I guess like if you're interested, I'd encourage you to go and like hunt through the ideas a little bit more and think about where they come up elsewhere in the scriptures. So for the sake of time, though, I don't want to belabor these word plays. We don't get to end our message this week with one of Micah's messages of hope, which we're going to see kind of sprinkled throughout his book. We will next week. And so it's on this kind of somber but maybe a little bit humorous note that we leave off. My last observation, though, is that the justice that is seen in these different towns is kind of a fitting or poetic justice. Those who put their trust into the beautiful things of this earth are only putting their trust into dust, and they're going to be let down. Those who put their trust into wealth will lose their money and status. Those who are trusting into their technical or technological prowess will find that these things are only useful to flee ultimately from an overwhelming enemy. I think we're still often struck by this kind of misplaced hope in our own lives on a personal level. And I think that's where we begin our fight against our own sinful hearts. John Calvin called the human heart a factory of idols. And it's an interesting thing to think about, that we have this tendency to want to bring our attention down away from our Creator and onto things that we can manipulate and control more so, and to try to put our trust into what we can do. But we often end up paying the price for our trust into these lesser beings, these lesser deities, right? So here's kind of a final table talk today for you to reflect on as you go through this week. Do you have something like a bank account or status or power or drugs or sex or money or family or friendships or your job or whatever else that you tend to find as your like source of your identity, or you put your trust in it? And then how can you work to guard against making an idol of this thing? Be blessed, and we'll see you next week for chapter 2.